it was saying something to me, but I couldn't read it at that distance. Friends, welcome, let us pray. O Lord, take our minds and think through them. Take our lives and live through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you. Guide us in the way. Reveal to us your truth. And bless us with life everlasting. For your Son is our way, our truth, and our life, now and forever. Amen. Thank you very much for coming. I have always enjoyed these opportunities to be with you, to explore, to think, to be creative with our words, to try and find our way and deepen our appreciation of God's way with us. I've loved that over many years, and as my time at Guildford draws to a close, I do want to say a sincere thank you, and I will do so through one of my favourite anecdotes. A little old lady goes to the back of church on a Sunday morning, shakes the vicar's hand, as usually happens, as you know, and says, "That was a lousy sermon today. Next Sunday, I must listen harder." And I've used that when I'm teaching preaching to others, because to me it captures something. For a sermon only works, both if good words are spoken and people listen well. And I would say, I have grown in my ministry enormously here in terms of exploring the faith with adults, because you are a group of people who listen hard. And it really is, to me, it feels like a two-way venture. We did a session, Jonathan and I did a session in the autumn on death and dying, on final judgment, on heaven and hell. And I know a number of you were here, and it was really appreciated. So trying to do it in the same sort of style, I'm going to say something. Brian is my conversation partner today, and as we get in the swing of it, I hope there'll be comments from the floor as well. Jonathan is managing things online because we have a number of people who are now joining us this evening. Welcome to you. And I know there are a number of people who are going to listen, so this is being recorded. I really will try to remember that if you ask a question, I will repeat it back, partly because I've got to check that I've heard it, but also so people online know exactly what was said. So we're doing this tonight. We're doing it 7:30 next Tuesday evening, and then I think we've got a couple of weeks break, and we are going to hold, as we've done for many, many years, a Passover meal on the Tuesday of Holy Week. That will not be online, that will not be recorded, that will be a real meal here, and if you would like to come,
screen it.
Email the office and sign up with them, because it is a meal. Steve Marriott is cooking roast lamb. The oven is on as we speak. The sprouts will go on tomorrow, metaphorically maybe. It would be lovely to have you there, but you can see with candles and with setting out tables here, what a wonderful place this is to hold this sort of event. So do sign up for that if you'd like to. That's on Tuesday, April the 4th or so. Great. In the Sunday school, not here, but in the Sunday school, they taught in a very clear way. Who is the Son of God? Jesus. Who died for our sins? Jesus. That sort of approach. But one Sunday they had a new teacher who wanted to start in a different sort of way. So at the beginning of the Sunday school class, the new teacher said, "So what is grey and fluffy and has a white fluffy tail with floppy ears, bounces along and eats grass?" Hand goes up. "Okay, Jimmy, what's the answer?" "I know the answer's Jesus, but it sounds awfully like a bunny." Is my way of saying, Jesus is not the answer to everything. And I will get drummed out of some brownie packs by saying that. But that's part of the way into what I want to cover tonight. Jesus is not the answer to everything, chiefly because we need to be alert to what questions are being asked. And although, to use the technical language, I'm going to go into the theories of the atonement tonight with Brian, actually, in ordinary speak, the church is the essential task of the church is to listen to the questions that people are asking and then try and bring all our resources, biblical resources, resources of liturgy and prayer, of buildings and community, of everything. But the first requirement is that we are alert to the nature of the questions people are asking. And so I will say, I wasn't in that Sunday school with the fluffy bunny, but I did, as a student, I did often work in the vacations, in the college vacations, by going on missions with the church I belonged to in Oxford. And the standard pattern was, it was always 5 evenings, 5 days, and the big thing was, after visiting and going to schools and whatever, there were 5 major talks in the evening. And I soon learnt the pattern. It was always the same. The first evening is on creation, the second evening is on fall, the third evening is on the crucifixion, the fourth evening is the altar call, saying all that theology doesn't get anywhere unless you respond, and the fifth evening is celebration, gifts of the Spirit. It's not a bad approach. Creation, the goodness of creation, and that was the warm-up, and I can remember, as it were, sitting here. I wasn't giving the talks, but sitting at the front, looking at the audience. They're engaged with that. People love hearing about and reflecting on the goodness of creation. Second evening, and it goes wrong. Whether you call it the doctrine of original sin or the fall, we know goodness goes awry. The third evening, really tough. The speaker would always speak about Jesus dying on the cross and stop there. Not telling people that they had to respond, but just telling the story. But what I really noticed was so often that the emotional temperature dipped massively after evening 3. People want to hear about creation and fall, and they recognise Jesus is important, and they know about the cross. They wouldn't have been there otherwise. And then, so often it felt it didn't work. And I long puzzled about that until I came up with the basic reaction that what was happening was the preacher, the speaker, was not attending to the questions in the audience. They were giving the answer that the preacher wanted to give, but was not connecting. So what questions are being asked? And I can't finish that sentence without saying today. And I think Brian might be just reflecting with us a bit on how the questions have changed over the years. The word that I've heard quite often recently is that the church is tone deaf. Not because it is by its nature quite conservative, but because it's not getting the questions that people really want to engage with. So I think just a moment to give an example, just as one example, to reflect on the history of science and religion. In fact, I walked into Waterston's the other day, just 2-3 days ago, and there was a 300-page book, not on the subject of science and religion, or indeed science against religion, but reflecting on how has that debate, science and religion, changed over the centuries. You'll probably know that certainly in this country and in Western Europe, things started to go awry around the time of Darwin. Darwin's often the peg on which a lot of argument is hung. But actually the reality is in the 1850s, an awful lot of the leading scientists were profoundly Christian and took their faith seriously and their science seriously. And what they were seeking was, if science tells us this, how must our faith adapt the way it is phrased so we can take this seriously? It wasn't putting the Bible in second place. It was saying, we really want to take our faith seriously and we want to take our science, whether it's on evolution, on chemistry, on physics, on astrology, or whatever. We want to take it seriously. Fast forward 100 years, and by the 1950s, it had solidified into a science against religion. And the sadness of that for me is not only does it make our task as people who want to represent the Christian faith more difficult, but actually I have read books that cause me great dismay because they're by leading scientists who seem unable to take religion seriously. It was the Stephen Hawking book, I think called A History of the Universe. I loved reading it. I barely understood the first 11 out of 12 chapters, but you know you're in the presence of greatness. Until the final chapter was when he addressed and what happened at or before the Big Bang. And he got into describing why his approach said God cannot exist. And all I could read in that chapter was the God that Hawking feels cannot exist is a Sunday school God. It was so petty and small-minded. It wasn't the sort of God I imagine that any of us would dream of beginning to try and describe and explain, convey to others. Wonderful. Read the first 11 chapters, fantastic. Chapter 12 really undermined the argument about trying to bring science and religion together. And I'll pause in a moment, but let me just give you one more example of this. You will know that we in this parish and with friends in Guildford and many others take environmental concerns really seriously. I've seen, especially young people, whether they are primary school children or students or whatever, the younger generation certainly take environmental issues seriously. But one of the things I've noticed is just how much their passion for treating the environmental issues seriously is closely aligned to their desire to take the life of the Spirit seriously. In other words, there is not a clash here between, let's call it, green issues and faith. Rather, the exact opposite. We want to take green issues seriously. Please help us with the resources to do that. Or it works vice versa. I'm one who watched the first episode of the new David Attenborough series last night, and sitting there feeling, delighting in the wisdom and the photography, and feeling moved at the core of my being, because although he is not using religious language, there couldn't be a more spiritual program not using religious language than something like that. I want to pause just to give Brian a chance to exercise his voice and his legs, because he's going to come here. We haven't quite yet got to the atonement, but Brian, say something. Wise.
Goodness. there's, in my experience in my working life in universities, was some reason the physicists seemed very comfortable with religious thought and religious experience for a reason that I never fully understood. It seemed to be the life scientists who were very disturbed by religious thought and couldn't somehow run them parallel. And that ended up in quite a number of interesting discussions that the physicist would see the wonder and the enormity of the universe, and in one part of their souls they were daunted by that. The life scientists seemed to be very absorbed in the whole process of reproduction and competition and all the things that we're aware of in nature. And I think it was really the ruthlessness of survival. There is a term, the pitilessness of competitive existence in the wild that made them feel uncomfortable with the idea of a generous, loving God. That was my reaction to it.
I think that's fantastic, Brian, because not least it's something of what I'm saying, which is let's listen either to the questions or to the approach they have. And people who are embedded in different disciplines, I love the idea of if you're daunted by the universe, you're naturally more likely to be humbled and then readier to catch glimpses of what we would call a transcendent God. We mustn't therefore dismiss economists and sociologists. We must be ready to listen to how they might engage. I want to just I'll open it up in a moment. I just want to give the briefest of reflection on one topic that clearly is a very hot and divisive topic at the moment. And I certainly haven't got my mind at all around why it is so. But I do feel it is a really powerful example of how the church is not yet able to engage with what is going on. And that's the topic of gender. So I'm not going to talk about the General Synod in the Church of England and the difficulty with blessing same-sex marriages, though that's a presenting problem. But you will know how much this is people are getting caught out by this. I don't fully understand what's going on. But I think there are layers to this, one of which is how much can we choose and how much is given. And I think there is a natural assumption in the generation younger than we who are here that actually the emphasis is on choice and agency, making ourselves who we are, rather than givenness. Now, I see that you can do good theology with an emphasis on either, but the church seems to be stacking all its chips on gender is given, God makes us who we are, and therefore choice is not just secondary, but is much less relevant. I think there's also another dimension about a recognition of how dominant Western thought from Western Europe has been. And I remember reading just last year, a very powerful article forgive me, I can't remember which culture, which has 7 genders. And that's something, if you said that to General Synod, they'd just go, what? And it's that inability to say, well, no, you not to say you're wrong, but if you're talking to someone who is more comfortable with a 7-gendered world, then simply saying you can't bless those 2 people just is missing so much. There's also within the whole gender conversation something about finding identity, who we belong to, and all sorts of what I would call tribal areas. We want to be associated with them and not others. And navigating that sort of conversation is really, really difficult. So I think, to sum up, what feels, I imagine, fairly straightforward, but just it's been worth underlining, is part of the Christian contribution to good engagement with people in the world, people who almost certainly are seeking deeply spiritual answers, responses to the awesomeness of life. The importance of the Christian vocation is to listen. Not necessarily to seek for answers. I try and always avoid that word, but responses. You may say that. Can I respond? So it's not disagreeing with them. It is saying, I recognise what you're saying, but what this does for me, here is my response. And I want to use 2 words that actually I've used in the letter, our weekly letter that will be published next week, just to pull things apart. There are 2 words that are used in terms of branches of theology. One is dogmatics, and the other is apologetics. They're certainly technical words, but dogmatics means to do with dogma, doctrine. It's the branch of theology where theologians come together to try and explain what we read in Scripture, what we have thought, what has been thought over the generations. It is a technical word, but the irony is that people who do dogmatics so often can be dogmatic. Secondly, apologetics. Apologetics technically means trying to give a reason for what you believe. And you can only do that. Dogmatics can sit in their study and do, if Jenny's doing dogmatics, she can do it locked behind her closed door on her own. But if Rod is doing apologetics, you can only do it with others, with a conversation partner. For years, I put all my money on apologetics. That's where my heart and soul lies. But I've increasingly recognised that apologetics is still trying to explain to others what I believe. So I think I just want to note that there's a third: dogmatics, apologetics, and there's a third one, which is, actually, I don't just want to try and explain to others what I believe. I want to listen to others so that they can explain to me what they believe, and so a conversation can begin between us. Dogmatics, apologetics, conversation. And you know conversations only work if we listen. The great hero of a generation ago of apologetics was C.S. Lewis. But I want to name the book that I think for our generation now and beyond trumps whatever C.S. Lewis wrote. It's Francis Spufford's book called Unapologetic. With all the play on he is not being, he's being confident. But what I love, apart from the play on that word, unapologetic, what I love is the subtitle to that book. Why, despite everything, Christianity can still make surprising emotional sense. And as I checked that this evening before coming down here, I just noted again how much is packed into the subtitle. Why, despite everything, even that, you know, we are so often on the back foot. That's what it's like. The church in its best character has been on the back foot for 2,000 years. That's fine, because on the back foot you have to listen to what people are saying. Why, despite everything, Christianity can still have confidence, being conversational, being an apologist. We can only do this because actually our tradition says we have access to resources that people want and need. Christianity can still make surprising emotional sense. And if there's one thing I long for in the church, it's a deeper emotional intelligence to hear the questions that are being asked and then trusting that we will be able to make the resources, bring the resources we know we have into conversation. I'm going to pause there. Brian, I know you've got something to say now, but shall we just see what is in the room for a moment? Peter, as you're fleet of foot, why don't you just come and stand here, and you've got 5 seconds to work out what you're going to say.
Thank you.
You've worked it out already. It just means then that I don't have to repeat it.
Well, I'm still fleet
But
of
if
foot.
you don't want to come up here,
It was actually triggered by what Brian was saying. I was thinking of the sort of physicist way of seeing the world, the universe, and more biological sciences. And I was thinking, I guess in some ways, God has often been the thing that can control and understand the thing that I can't. And I was just wondering whether there's, therefore, as we understand the body so much, and as we understand cells and chromosomes and all of this, and genes, that actually we feel we can control that, but there's still this other thing out there that is so much bigger than us. And I was wondering whether there's therefore an approach to God that is actually about what I can control and what I can't control. And what I can't control, I want a God who can kind of do that for me.
Pete, thank you. I think you've certainly put your finger on it. One of the trends, if I understand it in scientific thought, one of the approaches scientific thought over the last 100 years can be that as we understand more, the space left for God is squeezed. The more we understand, whether it's about body or economics or society or whatever, God is just simply squeezed. And that leads to the common phrase about the God of the gaps. We only need God for those moments. We'll probably come on to that a bit more in a moment. When there are earthquakes and tragedies, that's a gap, and we reach for God, and that's just when we know God can't respond. But as you were speaking, Pete, I'm a mathematician by training. Have you ever read the book that is about Andrew Wiles proving Fermat's last theorem? If John... You haven't read it? Am I the only one who's read it? Sorry, bread and butter. I didn't understand Stephen Hawking. So Fermat's last theorem? Yeah. Fermat's last theorem, a really difficult thing. Fermat, the day before he was killed in the duel, was scribbling down everything that was in his brain. He scribbled down, and I've got a lovely proof for this, but I don't have time to do it. And for 150 years, no one could prove it. And actually, after 100 years, everyone thought he didn't have a proof either. Anyway, Andrew Wiles, who was professor of mathematics at various universities, ended up at Oxford, locked himself away in his study for 7 years because he wanted to work on it without anyone knowing about it, because otherwise he thought people might, whatever. And Pete, It's a beautiful description because this author has obviously talked to Andrew Wiles. The moment when that afternoon he suddenly saw one piece of the jigsaw the other way round and he'd got the proof. And at that moment, the way it's described, it wasn't another bit of the world has been understood and there's even less space for God. It was the exact opposite. I know of him to know that he's not a religious man. But if you read carefully the language he described, what it was like when suddenly, after 7 years solo work, and after the world's best mathematicians have been working on it for 150 years, he saw it and realised he had got the proof. That was, to use language Brian and I would use, that was a transcendental moment. In other words, pushing back the boundaries of knowledge is not squeezing God out, because God is in the knowledge. And that's where I read the first 11 chapters of Hawkins' book and feel God is in all that. I feel God is in the David Attenborough programs. It's not the bit left over at the end. So as you were saying that, I'll get you the title of, I'll lend you the book. I'll lend anyone the book. Form an orderly queue. Another reaction to what we're saying. Brian, it seems like we need John Milton.
It's what you were saying about dogmatics and how that can be done by Jenny in her back bedroom or by herself. And I was thinking, that's part of the problem, I think, for the church communicating with everybody. Because the church comes out, or has, for nearly 2,000 years, come out with statements which are entirely sets of propositions, as if they're problems which can best be resolved or only be resolved by rational argument. And I think most people, I certainly, would rather tackle theological problems from the experience of people. Can I take, for example, one of the classic arguments for the goodness of the one all-powerful and all-loving God in a world wholly created by God, where evil is nevertheless evident. And St. Augustine came up with the idea, well, others did as well, that evil must mean an absence of good. He writes, what, after all, is anything we call evil but the privation of good? So, everything is created by God, and God would not create any evil, so evil must mean an absence of good. Imagine saying that to a crowd of prisoners being herded into a gas chamber in Auschwitz. You are experiencing an absence of good. I mean, the chasm between the work of the intellect trying to put into words the nature, the being of God and the experience of a fallen world, and it comes up with evil must mean an absence of good. It can't help a world that experiences Auschwitz. It cannot. another proposition. God, in creating humankind, gave us freedom to choose good from evil. Therefore, evil is a consequence of the misuse of human freedom. Fine, except that evil must, in one sense, already exist for humankind to be able to make such a choice. So who created evil in the first place, if not the all-powerful Creator God? And the result of all that is that all those great theologians of the first millennium were fighting to make certain that somehow we never suggested that there was another God or semi-God who was arguing and fighting against the God. Well, you can work that all out. You can say, no, there is just one God, and then you come up with complicated theories about God somehow retreating and allowing things to happen outside God's control. And that's never worked in people's imagination. Never. I would argue.
I'm about to do that. But
You're about to do
it's not
that.
gonna
Well,
work.
then we get on to John Milton. No, before you do, I want to go on to, in the imagination of Europe, in medieval and in, well, for most of the second millennium, evil was personified as the devil. And the devil was seen as real and powerful, even if theologians denied his existence. Because people's experience of violence and suffering convinces people otherwise. I just want to read to you the first 5 lines of one of the major poems in the English language, Milton's Paradise Lost, written in the middle of the 17th century. Time of the English Civil War. A lot of bloodshed, a lot of conflict, and a real awareness of that violence and that conflict, and a real awareness of the power of evil. And that's in this book, which had enormous impact on forming the certainly the English-speaking world's concepts of good and evil. The beginning of Book 2, high on the throne of royal state, which far outshone the wealth of Ormus and of Ind, or where the gorgeous East with richest hand showers on her kings barbaric pearl and gold, Satan exalted sat. Satan exalted sat, Robert, that is a personified vision of a huge power in opposition to God. And it wouldn't be acceptable to St. Augustine. So take it from there.
I used to like Brian. My topic for this evening apparently is how can we reconcile a good God with a world that is so familiar with violence, hatred and suffering. And my hunch is that many in the generation in which we live now will recognise so clearly the familiarity with violence, hatred and suffering. So we've got one end, we've got our firm grasp on that. So is the question, how can we reconcile, or if that is the world we live in, where are the glimpses of the good God? So that's what I'm trying to avoid here as I go into the second part, is not just imposing a question on you. How does good God allow evil? Because where I began is trying to phrase it in a way that is recognisable. And the young people I speak to, I think, are so familiar about how much the world is in a mess. Green, finance, pensions, inequalities, whatever. So we need to do it in terms that are recognisable to them. But the word atonement, basically at one, is about how do we keep hold of those two aspects firmly together. A world familiar with violence, hatred and suffering, and a good God. I won't go more than that. I won't start saying what Augustine said, which was omnipotent, all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing. Just a good God. And I just want to flesh out to you one or two approaches that I think still are worth recognising. They're classic approaches that are worth recognising. So I forgot to say at the beginning, my hope is this whole evening will take an hour or so. We're in the second half. But what we're doing now is this helpful way of recognising some patterns that have been spoken about for thousands of years, but are relevant because they may come up in conversation now. One of the ways of keeping a firm grasp on good God and a world familiar with violence, hatred and suffering is to say, in essence, they're not linked at all. God can be good, and we are in a vale of tears, and there is rather an enormous gap between the two. Now, some Christians do that. Some Christians see God like that and are very happy still to worship. It's very hard standing in such a beautiful church as this, knowing the history behind it, that we can simply come in here, experience some of that transcendent beauty and whatever, and go away into the vale of tears. Now, I'm glad this church exists, such a person might say, and Monday to Saturday is tough, but I don't really expect there to be much of a link between the two. That approach to understanding a good God and a vale of tears has been an approach that some Christian theologians have taken. Some other religions are much more comfortable with that. And actually the thought forms in the Greek and Roman world that the early church grew up in certainly had that sort of approach. The gods were on Mount Olympus and we're down here, and the two basically don't connect. And one of the first tasks of the early Christian church was to say that Jesus was the connector, the mediator, the way between the two. And for me, the story that captures that is the moment Jesus dies on the cross. The curtain in the temple was torn in two. The tearing of that, ironically, is also about the joining of heaven and earth. So to me, and if I was talking to a young student at school, I would want to steer well clear of allowing there to be a vale of tears and a transcendent God that weren't somehow connected. So is that identifying some of the questions that are being asked, some of the approach that needs to be understood and challenged? It just doesn't make sense to me that a good God and a vale of tears are both exist but are separate. The one that's really difficult, I think, is in when people begin the conversation based on suffering. And it's difficult partly because you being sensitive, we being sensitive, if someone's suffering, we generally don't try and start the conversation by telling them they're wrong or telling them how we're right or whatever. You want to naturally do some listening. And one of the things that is really tricky here in my experience is to find the right moment and the right way to go beyond simply being compassionate and get into conversation. Someone's just lost a loved one. You don't do it in the first conversation. You might not do it for 2 or 3 years. But do we sell ourselves short if we don't try and again engage with this? There is suffering in the world, but there is still goodness and a good God. The earthquake, the eruptions, the tsunamis. People say, how can God let that happen? When I hear that, what I'm looking for is, what are they assuming that is a block on the conversation going forward? How can God let that happen? Assumes that God is all powerful. And certainly the God I worship, I don't start by thinking God is all powerful. I do believe, deep in my soul, that there is nothing that can ultimately block God. But that's very different by saying God can do anything. If you have an approach that says God can do anything, why did God let that happen? God could have stopped it. So that's just one example of the help that we can provide in a conversation to get the conversation going is by listening for the assumptions that are being made. Why did God let my child die? The assumption there, and again, there's no way I would say this to a parent in the early years, but the assumption that God is a God who simply interferes with our life, rather than is always present in wherever we are, and trying to make things godly and holy. The idea that God is on the outside interfering. Why did God let that happen? Can you help them work out what is being assumed? And I find it very hard to respond to an interfering God. Just doesn't work, doesn't match my picture. Nature red in tooth and claw. You've already sort of referred to that, Brian. Yes, nature is red in tooth and claw, and so are sociologists. But if part of what is difficult there for our conversation partner is the fairness, is the justice in the world, or do we just live in a random world? I think that's one of the things that I hear younger people saying, with some sense of despair at times, that actually I can do good, you can do good, there can be pockets of goodness, but actually if you stand back and look at the world overall, it's can we really suppose that there is justice and fairness and purpose? One of the theories of the atonement that I value is seldom spoken of. It's often in our hymns, but is seldom spoken of nowadays, and that's called Christus Victor, the victorious Christ. And it's not talking about the final defeat of evil, which is where I think Paradise Lost eventually takes us, the journey towards that. It's about that in the life, death and resurrection of Christ, the chaos has begun to be pushed back. And I like that language, and I think people resonate with that language, because as we read the papers, as we experience the world today, we are so aware of how much we long to be in control and we're not. And the idea not that Satan is sitting on his throne, an all-powerful being, but just that there is so much chaos, uncontrolledness in the world. But that what Christ did in his life, death and resurrection was start to push back the forces of chaos. I think is an image of how God relates to us that is fruitful. I'll just finish with this before inviting contributions. Whatever way we try and hold together good God and the veil of tears that we experience, the question that I think is always worth asking is, how does the goodness of God inspire, motivate and transform us? So there's a lovely line that you'll be familiar with. There is a green hill far away. He died that we might be forgiven. He died to make us good. And there's a real, in that last line, he died to make us good, I think captures something of the heart of the sort of God I relate to. But I still don't quite know how it works. But if I'm taking something into a conversation with others, that's what I want to convey to them. That actually by having one hand firmly on that sense of the goodness of God, that is not just God's alone, but his goodness somehow is one of the things that can make me and my life and my contribution to the world better. That's what I want to convey to others. So that's a quick rattle through a number of ways that the church has experienced and tried to not explain, Brian, but describe atonement, the holding on to either end. And I would love to hear from you as to what I might have missed, or are there images that have been particular moving to you in your experience, or do you have some handle on what questions are being put to you that challenge this idea of holding together the goodness and the veil of tears? Again, I'll invite Brian to say something, but first... Have we got anyone online?
Do please ask if you've got any questions or would like to come in online, by all means.
Sorry, it's just that otherwise I'll have to repeat what you say. Great.
Thank you. I finally reacting to Brian's comment about physicists, because in early life I was a physicist. And I think possibly one of the reasons why physicists can at times be, Christianity can be appealing to physicists, is in their struggle to actually comprehend the scale of what one is trying to talk about in a universe. You can say the universe is 14.5 billion years old, but most people struggle to remember what they did last month. A billion years is quite a long time. 14 is immeasurable. If you've struggled to get your mind round quantum coupling, which many people are very wise never to try, you start to understand that some things don't have easy answers. And going through what's been said today, I think, is the fact that people are trying to get easy answers from the church. And for some things there are no easy answers. And we have to live with a void. That's one dimension I've got in reflecting what's been said. The other is that physics, all of physics, is about trying to explain how we have got to where we are. does not address at all purpose. And when we talked to that TV physicist Brian Cox, he explained that God wasn't necessary in the model, that we came from the Big Bang. In a billion years, the sun will be a red dwarf and will consume the Earth, and eventually the whole universe will go cold. And he said this with a smile on his face. Now, I personally am not comfortable if that is all there is to it. I think there has to be purpose, and I think the absence of purpose is something which can affect a lot of people. So just a couple of thoughts.
Very good. Thank you very much. Purpose, yes. My experience, especially of working with young people, is helping them find that rather than telling them it's there.
Absolutely.
Is that because it can be found in so many ways. I love your use of the word scale, because it goes both large and... If you don't want to borrow my book on Fermat's last theorem, there is another book we're getting rid of 90% of our books before we go to Bristol, but I've kept this book on quantum biology. I could lend that to you if but that is on how processes are driven at the microscopic scale. I just think for the moment, that's the word I'm going to walk away with tonight, about how, in discussing things with a conversation partner, you might want to try and find at what scale. What's the scale that allows the conversation to get going? And that could be history, it could be microscopic, it could be massive. So you could...
Sorry, I just said one further thought I should have mentioned, which is absolutely useless if you're talking to somebody at the personal level who's had a personal loss of a child or something. But if you're sticking to the big picture, if you go back to Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, over millennia, there has never been a time when the world is as safe as it is now. So if you want to look for the hand of God, it is possibly one route in is to talk about, no matter how bad you think things are now, it has never been a better place. I think Obama said something similar.
So I'm going to give you tonight, and I will make available on the website, an article from the Church Times last week that is a report of a discussion and an article between Nick Cave, rock star, and Rowan Williams. Mr. Cave says about the experience of grief when his 15-year-old son died. It became relational, a kind of vibrational field within the world that feels like the presence of a third entity. I am part of a vast river of suffering. And it was shocking to find that my own tragedy was ordinary on some level. I felt part of something. Someone called it the club no one wants to be in. But for the first time, I found that I started to become a more complete person, a fully realised person, as opposed to a personality that was partially formed and fragmented. And I find that awesome. So he's just lost his 15-year-old son, and it is through the suffering that he finds that he's actually, what was that phrase? I found my tragedy was ordinary because I belonged in a vast river of suffering. So that what can be, we've got the veil of tears, how can we hold on to that and the goodness of God? Actually, it was experienced like that. By embracing, or by having to embrace the veil of tears, he found the presence of God. If I may, just one other, it's not for me to interfere with the parish profile when you're looking for a new rector, but you might want to use words something along these lines. So he's talking about, what's he talking about? He's talking about grief and faith, and about a certain respectability as tenuous as hope, returning to the idea that grown-ups might actually go to church. Isn't that, he asks, what the church is there for? Rowan Williams sighs. If only that were what it felt like more of the time. But yes, that's what it's for. I experience your presence tonight as a very bold affirmation that the church is where grown-ups might actually choose to go, not to escape the suffering or the puzzles, but to be resourced so we can be good listeners and make good conversation happen. But I've chosen the easy option tonight, because if you recite the creed, there is nothing about the atonement in the creed. There is something about Jesus, the Son of God. And in some ways, with the atonement, the church has always recognised there is no definite answer. We have to keep on trying in conversation. Why I find what I'm going to do next week more difficult is that actually the church has said to some questions, this is the answer. Who is Jesus? The Son of God. I'm less comfortable with answers, so next week is a way of trying to find words that make sense of the experience, rather than just giving them the end of what might be a conversation, the Son of God. But how? Why? How does it work? That's what I would like to attend to next week. Shall we pray? Gracious God, in the stillness of this place, we are aware of the faithful ones who have prayed and served and kept the faith. We feel the presence of those whose lives have been celebrated, births marked, those who are buried here, and we pray both for ourselves and the church in our generation, that we may be found faithful, sensitive and compassionate, ready to seek wisdom, to find your grace with companions on our way. So guide us in what we say and do, that others may be drawn close to your care, your love, your life. I invite you to say with me the Lord's Prayer in the traditional form. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord. And by thy great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers of this night. For the love of thy only Son, our Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen.